I will fine you. Jasmine, the words from Judge Andrew Napolitano cracked through the marble halls of Congress. Live before 38 million Americans. $200,000 had already flowed into his pocket, while an entire town gasped for breath under poisoned skies. Jasmine Crockett's answer? Slamming a blood-red check onto his desk. What could make a man in power fear the truth more than the law itself? The wind in Riverton didn't just smell like rain. It carried a bitter, metallic sting that scratched the back of your throat and settled deep in your chest. People here had learned to taste danger in the air, and in the last 2 years that danger had stolen more lives than anyone dared count out loud. Once a proud steel town, Riverton now felt like a place waiting for the next funeral. Martha Lewis knew that feeling too well. A widow for a decade, she now spent her days caring for her grandson, a boy with eyes too tired for 11. The chemo had taken his hair, the oxygen tube had taken his freedom. Yet when Jasmine Crockett stepped onto her porch, he still managed a shy wave that broke her heart all over again. Jasmine didn't arrive with cameras or speeches. She came with a worn leather notebook and a promise to listen. She hugged Martha, held Luis's hand, and asked questions that cut straight to the truth. Before leaving, she looked them in the eye and swore she'd carry their voices to the Capitol. But in Washington, not everyone wanted those voices heard. Judge Andrew Napolitano wasn't the kind of man you overlooked. Charismatic, sharp in a tailored suit, and with a voice that cut through noise like a blade, he'd built a reputation as a champion of liberty. On television, he was the calm authority people trusted to make sense of chaos, but behind Washington's closed doors, a different picture formed. Whispers told of quiet dinners, off-the-record calls, and a consulting deal with the very corporation accused of poisoning Riverton. Nothing anyone dared wave as proof, but enough to make insiders lower their voices when his name came up. Napolitano knew the hearing would be broadcast nationwide, and he intended to control it. Flipping through a stack of legal snares and procedural traps, he prepared to stop Jasmine Crockett cold in her tracks. To him, this wasn't a debate. It was a chess game, and she was a pawn wandering into checkmate. He believed he could corner her, strip her credibility, and walk away untouchable. What he didn't know was that Jasmine wasn't coming with just testimony. She carried something heavier than words. Hard proof that could flip the entire game on its head. And once it hit the light, there would be no taking it back. By 6 a.m., the hallways of Congress were already humming. Someone had leaked Jasmine's evidence. Marble halls gleamed under cold light, echoing with hurried footsteps. Outside, camera crews jostled for position, their lenses hunting for the perfect shot. Inside, the low hum of metal detectors mixed with the chatter of reporters. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the main entrance with a steady stride, her leather notebook tucked under one arm. She nodded to staffers, shook hands quickly, but her focus never wavered. The air felt heavy, not from the weather, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Near the committee room, Congressman Daniel Reed waited. A moderate Republican, he carried himself like a man who wanted the truth, but wasn't sure he'd like what he found. He greeted Jasmine with a polite nod, his eyes sharp, measuring every word she said. Across the hall, Clara Vaughn was already live on her phone, speaking to thousands of viewers. The investigative journalist had a knack for catching moments others missed, and today she was here to catch all of them. She gave Jasmine a quick thumbs up before turning back to her stream. By mid-morning, the networks made it official. The hearing would be broadcast live nationwide. Anchors filled the air with speculation. Analysts debated outcomes, and the country began to choose sides before a single word was spoken. What no one knew was that this wasn't going to be just another hearing. Millions were about to watch a storm break in the most unexpected way. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and Judge Andrew Napolitano leaned into the microphone. His tone was smooth, almost polite, but the edge was impossible to miss. He welcomed the committee, thanked the public for watching, then turned his gaze toward Jasmine Crockett. Some of us are here for the fact, he said, pausing just long enough to let the cameras catch his expression. And some, perhaps, for the cameras. The jab landed exactly where he wanted. Subtle enough to pass as formality, sharp enough to draw blood. A few heads in the gallery turned toward Jasmine, waiting to see if she'd bite. She didn't. Instead, she adjusted her microphone and began laying out her opening statement, her voice calm, steady, unshaken. One by one, she introduced the first pieces of evidence. Photographs of corroded pipes, timelines of safety reports ignored, statements from environmental experts. She slid each document across the table to the clerk, the sound of paper against wood echoing in the chamber. Viewers at home began to take sides. Some nodded along with Napolitano's controlled demeanor, convinced he held the high ground. Others leaned in closer to their screens, drawn to Jasmine's quiet resolve, the way she never raised her voice but made every word count. Napolitano watched her carefully, lips pressed into a faint smile. He let her build her case, let her audience grow comfortable in her control. Then he leaned forward, voice dropping just enough to make the moment feel personal. "Congresswoman," he said, "before we go any further, there's a matter we must address." His eyes locked on hers. Then he struck where he thought she was weakest. Her credibility. Napolitano adjusted his glasses, his tone even but laced with steel. "Congresswoman Crockett has committed multiple procedural violations," he said, tapping the papers in front of him with a deliberate rhythm. "For defaming a duly incorporated American business without proper basis, this committee is imposing a fine of $75,000. The gavel came down with a crack that made the microphones pop. A gasp rolled through the room like a wave hitting a seawall. Reporters froze mid-note. Cameras swung in for a closer shot. In the gallery, Jasmine's supporters shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs just loud enough to be picked up by the boom mics. One leaned forward and whispered, "Let it go! Jasmine, this isn't the hill to die on." But Jasmine didn't look away from Napolitano. Her hands stayed flat on the table, shoulders squared. She took in one long, steady breath, letting the silence stretch until even the air in the room felt heavier. Napolitano smirked slightly, certain she was cornered. When she spoke, her voice carried across the chamber without rising in volume. "If the truth costs $75,000, she said, locking eyes with him, "I'll pay in full. And add interest." The line landed like a shot. A single clap rang out from the back before being quickly silenced. A reporter in the press box mouthed, "Wow," as fingers flew across laptop keys. On social media, the moment was already trending, captions popping up under hashtags calling out the fine. Napolitano's jaw tightened, the smirk gone. This wasn't the reaction he'd counted on. He'd expected her to retreat quietly. Instead, she had just escalated the fight. And her next move would make the whole country lean closer to their screens. Clara Vaughn's camera stayed fixed on Jasmine, but her eyes flicked toward Napolitano. In the split second he thought no one was watching, he let a small, satisfied smirk curl at the corner of his mouth as he shuffled the stack of papers in front of him. It wasn't the expression of a man confident in the truth. It was the look of someone who believed the game was already won. Up on the dais, Congressman Daniel Reed noticed it too. His brow furrowed, the faintest frown forming as he leaned back in his chair. Reed didn't like grandstanding from either side, but something about that smirk scratched at his instincts. It felt rehearsed, calculated. Jasmine didn't take her eyes off him. Past Napolitano's shoulder, she could see the victims seated in the gallery. Martha, with her grandson's small hand wrapped in hers. Louis sitting stiff, coughing quietly into a handkerchief. Their faces weren't angry. They were pleading. Trusting her to carry the weight. She straightened her notes but didn't look down at them. Her gaze stayed locked on the people who had traveled hours, some in pain, just to be in that room. In her mind, she repeated the promise she'd made on their porches and in their kitchens. I won't break. Napolitano glanced up, perhaps expecting to see defeat in her eyes. What he saw instead was resolve. Steady, unflinching, and dangerous to any man who thought money could bury the truth. She was about to turn his fine into the most expensive mistake of his career. Jasmine waited for the murmur in the chamber to fade. Then she leaned into the microphone, her tone calm but edged with steel. Hi, before I accept the fine, she said, I'd like to provide context, so the record reflects exactly what we're talking about. Without waiting for approval, she reached for the remote on the table. The lights dimmed slightly as the first image filled the big projection screen. A boy no older than 12, his head bare from chemo, his smile thin but stubborn, his name, age, and diagnosis appeared in white letters beneath the photo. One by one, the images rolled. An elderly man with an oxygen tank, a teenager with scars from surgery down his chest, a young mother holding a baby whose skin was modeled from a rare condition doctors traced back to chemical exposure. Each name and illness appeared like a silent indictment. Halfway through, the screen lit up with the face of a little boy, eyes bright but framed by the unmistakable pallor of illness. His mother sat in the gallery, and when she saw it, she broke. The sob tore out of her before she could cover her mouth, the sound echoing through the mics and across the chamber. The gallery went still. Even the reporters stopped typing. Cameras cut to Napolitano, bleak, stone-faced, his gavel poised in his hand, as if ready to restore order with a single strike. But the moment was already bigger than his authority. It hung in the air, raw and undeniable, a truth too heavy for decorum to contain. And no gavel could drown out what came next. Jasmine let the last image fade from the screen before speaking again. Madam Chair, she said evenly, I call Evan Porter to the stand. A tall, wiry man stepped forward, his hands clasped tightly, the kind of grip you see when someone's holding back years of frustration. Evan had spent 16 years inside the Riverton plant as a senior engineer. He didn't bother with pleasantries. We warned them, he began, his voice carrying through the chamber. We reported cracks in the containment tanks. We documented chemical levels 5 times the federal limit. Every single time, we were told to cut costs and keep quiet. The room leaned in. Evan spoke of safety inspections canceled at the last minute, of maintenance budgets slashed to pad quarterly profits, of executives laughing in meetings about the legal shield, the high-powered lawyers who could make lawsuits disappear before they reached a jury. Evan's words hung in the air like a live wire. For a moment, the room was frozen. No one dared to move. But what Jasmine showed next would stun even her allies. She shifted in her seat, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table to the clerk. Enter this into the record, she said. The document appeared on the projection screen. At the top, payment authorization. $200,000. Payee, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Purpose, consulting services. The chamber erupted. Gasps collided with the rapid-fire pop of camera flashes. In the press box, Clara Vaughn's fingers flew over her phone. Seconds later, her tweet went live. 1.2 memoirs to Napolitano from Riverton Chemical Blood Money. Within minutes, the hashtag was already trending. Napolitano sat motionless, his jaw set, but the color had drained just enough for the cameras to catch it. The man who prided himself on liberty had just been shackled by the truth. Napolitano reached for his microphone, his fingers gripping the base just a little too tightly. This, he began, his voice catching before he cleared his throat. This is nothing more than political theater. The words came out uneven, stripped of the polish that usually wrapped his sentences. Cameras zoomed in, catching the flicker of strain behind his eyes. He shuffled his papers again, looking for footing, but the rustle only seemed to underline his loss of control. These so-called records are being twisted to smear my name, he pressed on. and I will not dignify them with... He stopped when Congressman Daniel Reed leaned toward his own mic. Judge Napolitano, Reed said evenly, are you denying the payment occurred, or simply denying that it influenced your decisions? The question hit the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Reporters sat up straighter, pens poised. Napolitano opened his mouth, then closed it again, his jaw tightening. From her seat, Jasmine watched him with steady eyes. She didn't gloat. There was no need. Instead, a faint smile touched her lips. Not of victory, but of quiet resolve. The kind of smile that told anyone paying attention she wasn't finished. Napolitano glanced toward the gallery, as if hoping for some visible support. What he saw instead were the faces of Riverton, unblinking, waiting, their pain now stamped into the official record. He turned back to his papers, trying to summon the composure that had carried him through countless hearings. But the rhythm was gone, the ground shifting beneath his feet. And Jasmine, she hadn't even played her last card. Napolitano tapped his gavel twice, forcing a brittle calm back into the room. Given the sensitive nature of certain corporate contracts, he began, voice regaining some of its practiced authority, this committee will move into closed session. He emphasized national security like it was a shield big enough to hide behind. Reporters groaned quietly, cameras panning for reactions. In the gallery, Riverton's residents exchanged worried glances. They hadn't traveled all this way to watch the truth get locked behind closed doors. Jasmine leaned toward her microphone, her tone steady but cutting through the tension. If the people are poisoned in daylight, she said, the truth won't be buried in the dark. The words landed heavy, carrying more force than a raised voice ever could. A ripple of soft cheers moved through the gallery. Martha gripped her grandson's hand. Luis nodded slowly, and others murmured their agreement. Security stepped forward, motioning for everyone to remain seated, but the energy in the room had already shifted. Napolitano's expression hardened. He straightened in his chair, trying to reclaim the upper hand. Order in the chamber, he warned, tapping the gavel again. But the sound felt smaller now, like it was bouncing off walls that no longer belonged to him. For a moment, he believed he'd pulled the reins back, that his authority was intact. But what he didn't realize was that Jasmine had just turned his move into an opening. Napolitano thought he was back in control. He was wrong. Jasmine didn't waste the momentum. Ikern, Madam Chair, I call Dr. Helen McCarthy. A woman in her 50s rose from the gallery, white lab coat over a simple dress, a worn leather briefcase clutched in her hand. She walked with purpose to the witness table, her eyes fixed on Napolitano as if measuring his every breath. Helen had been Riverton's physician for over 20 years. She opened her briefcase, pulling out color-coded charts in thick folders. These are cancer rates before the spill, and these are after, she said, sliding the charts under the committee's cameras. So sorry, the lines on the graph didn't just rise. They spiked, tripling in just 18 months. Her voice trembled, but it wasn't from fear. A 300% increase, she said, each word striking like a gavel. These numbers aren't politics. They're coffins. Every point on this graph is a name, a face, a family. The chamber fell silent except for the click of camera shutters. In living rooms across America, viewers leaned closer, reading the captions as networks pushed the images on screen. On social media, the hashtag "Listen to Her" began to spread like wildfire, each post angrier than the last. Napolitano shifted in his seat, flipping through the pages without meeting Helen's eyes. Every second she spoke chipped away at the wall he tried to build around the truth. Jasmine sat back, letting Helen's testimony hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. She knew this was the kind of witness no committee spin could erase. But the final strike would come from Jasmine's own hands. The room was still buzzing from Dr. McCarthy's testimony when Jasmine rose from her seat. She didn't say a word at first. Instead, she picked up a long, flat object wrapped in brown paper and began walking toward Napolitano's desk. Every eye in the chamber followed her. She stopped just short of him, unwrapping the paper to reveal an oversized check. Across the front, in deep crimson ink that seemed to bleed into the fibers, the number screamed, $200,000. Jasmine held it up so the gallery and the cameras could see. "This isn't money," she said, her voice low but carrying through every microphone. "It's the price tag you put on their lives." She laid it on his desk with deliberate care, the red ink glowing under the harsh overhead lights. Napolitano's hand twitched as he reached for his gavel, then stopped halfway. The cameras caught the tremor in his fingers as they hovered over the check, as if touching it might burn. In the press box, Clara Vaughn mouthed, "Oh my God," while her live stream chat exploded. The gallery was silent, save for the faint hum of the air vents. Even security had paused, their eyes darting between the judge and the congresswoman. For a moment, time felt suspended, the weight of the gesture hanging in the space between them. Napolitano swallowed hard, his lips pressed into a thin line. The oversized check sat between them like a piece of evidence no lawyer could spin away. In living rooms across America, people leaned forward, waiting for his answer. Napolitano's eyes stayed on the crimson check, his jaw set tight. When he finally looked up, his voice had lost its edge. "On the advice of legal counsel," he said, "I will not be commenting further at this time." It was the safest answer he could give. And the most damning. A beat of silence hung in the chamber before Congressman Daniel Reed leaned toward his microphone. "Then let the record reflect," he said clearly, "that I am calling for a full ethics investigation into Judge Andrew Napolitano's conduct." The words hit like a hammer, and the cameras made sure the whole country saw it. The gallery exploded. Some stood and clapped. Others shouted in anger, the mix of cheers and outrage creating a roar that bounced off the marble walls. Martha clutched her grandson's hand, tears streaming down her face. Luis pumped his fist once before leaning back, coughing hard into his handkerchief. Security surged forward, trying to calm the crowd as committee members spoke over each other. Reporters yelled questions, their voices competing with the sound of gavels pounding for order. But order was already gone. The chair finally adjourned the hearing, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Napolitano gathered his papers without looking at anyone, the check still lying on the desk like a wound he couldn't close. Jasmine stepped back from the table, her expression steady, unshaken. The heavy wooden doors of the hearing room swung open, and the noise outside hit like a wave. A crowd had gathered in the hallway, spilling into the marble atrium, their voices rising in unison. "Jasmine! Jasmine!" The chant echoed off the high ceilings, filling every corner with defiance and hope. Martha Lewis was the first to reach her. She wrapped her arms around Jasmine, tears streaking her cheeks, her grandson pressed between them. "Thank you," Martha whispered, her voice breaking. Jasmine held her close, her hand resting gently on the boy's head. Jasmine turned to the crowd, her voice steady. "This isn't over. Not until Riverton breathes clean air again." The roar that followed shook the marble walls. And the fight had only just begun. In the days that followed, the spark lit in that hearing room turned into a fire across the country. Rallies erupted from small-town squares to the steps of state capitals, homemade signs waving with messages for Riverton. News networks rolled constant footage. Crowds chanting, candles burning at vigils, voices rising together for justice. In Washington, congressional petitions stacked up by the hundreds, signatures pouring in from every state. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle faced calls from their own voters to take action. Each day, the pressure built, and the name Riverton became a national headline no one could ignore. And then, one gray morning, Jasmine Crockett stood at the rusted gates of the Riverton plant. Martha Lewis was beside her, holding her grandson's hand. Luis Romero stood on the other side, coughing but smiling. Connie, behind them, dozens of townspeople gathered, their faces lined with hardship but lifted by hope. Jasmine looked up at the looming smokestacks, then back to the crowd. Her voice carried in the cool air, steady and sure. "Justice isn't charity," she said. "It's the debt we owe to each other." For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then the cheers came. Raw, unfiltered, unstoppable. When power tried to put a price on human life, Jasmine Crockett proved that truth spoken with courage can break through any wall. Justice isn't won in whispers. It's claimed when ordinary people refuse to look away. If you had been in that room, would you have stood with her? If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe to First Shock, where the voices of towns like Riverton are heard, and silence has no place to hide. Tap the bell. Because the next fight for justice could be in your own backyard. Which moment in Jasmine Crockett's stand hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments. Your voice could be the one that inspires the next change. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. All characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and education. It is not intended to defame or mislead, but to inspire reflection and civic awareness. Thanks for watching.